Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another virtual DDD, or actually good day, good morning, good whatever, wherever it is you are at this moment in time. And welcome to another virtual DDD session. Today we have Christina from the virtual DDD and with us, and we're going to discuss the topic. I'm very excited about this, is about Cat joining us about how epistemic injustice impact domain crunching. So welcome, Cat. Maybe you can do a short introduction.
Sure. Yes, I am Cat Swetel. I like working on weird things. I like working on things that either shouldn't exist anymore or shouldn't exist yet. That's kind of what I'm into. I don't know. Yeah, is that adequate?
Yeah, that's enough, I guess.
Terrific.
So if before we start, because I said I find it really interesting, I came across a few of your presentations and yeah, epistemic injustice. I guess that needs a small introduction, which you are going to give us, right? Because it's a
yes.
Yeah. So if you want to, please
yeah.
Let's start, and afterwards we will do a discussion, and we can have some Q&As.
Okay. Cool. I'll just do a short overview and share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Terrific. Yay. Okay. Yes. So this is going to be a short introduction to epistemic injustice because it isn't widely known outside of academia. First, I'll give a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not a philosopher. Like, I came to this concept because it was useful for me in my work, but not because I have any plans of becoming a philosopher, but it is a branch of study in philosophy. And so that's what you're going to find if you Google it. What is it? Epistemic injustice occurs when someone is wronged in their capacity as a knower. So they're somehow wronged in their capacity to be a knower. And the common example that we have in culture, in pop culture right now, is gaslighting. That's become a phrase that a lot of people are aware of these days. And it comes from this play and movie. And there's this woman and her husband keeps telling her, you're crazy, you're crazy, you're crazy. And at first she doesn't believe him, but then she starts to believe him. And it takes kind of this third party to come in and be like, hey, I also think your husband is super weird and perhaps hiding something. So then we end up with this term gaslighting. Probably many of you are familiar with it. It's also easy to Google if you want examples. So epistemic injustice kind of comes in two buckets typically, and the first one is testimonial injustice, and that's when someone is wronged in their capacity as a giver of knowledge. So for some reason, when I'm trying to give you knowledge, you're like not looking to have any of it, really. And the other way to think about this is that there's winners and losers in the credibility economy. So we have some people that before they even open their mouth to say anything, to tell us anything, we're like, yes, that person is believable. And then there are other people that are, before they say anything, we just are already questioning them. So this is typically something about you. So like, people might not trust my credibility because I'm a woman working in the tech space, or whatever, because I don't have a CS degree or something like that. The other tricky thing about testimonial injustice is that that's something that you can do to yourself. So you can believe about yourself that you don't have the credibility to actually know the things that you know from your lived experience. So you may not even volunteer information because you don't think that your knowledge is credible. And I'm sure in this community, in the DDD community, that is something that many, many, many of you have experienced grappling with, right? Like, how do you get people to actually volunteer the things that they know. And they're like, well, I'm not a developer or whatever the case may be. So that's something really common that at least I have seen a lot through the course of my career. The second bucket is hermeneutical injustice. And that's when someone is wronged in their capacity as a subject of social understanding. So testimonial injustice is like something that happens one-on-one, right? And hermeneutical injustice is more of like a systemic type thing. So this is when we don't even have the words, the narrative, to describe our own experience. This one is super tricky, and I think many of us have encountered this in a professional setting. It's when both the speaker and the hearer are laboring with the same inadequate tools. So neither party has the language to describe what's going on. And there are a couple really well-known examples of this. One of them being sexual harassment. That's actually a really recent term. There was no term for that until just a few short decades ago, right? So if you had that experience in your workplace, there literally was not a term for that. So you could be trying to explain that to someone and they could be trying to understand you, but you literally do not have the language. And I'm sure that's happened to many of us, having hopefully not sexual harassment, but the hermeneutical injustice in the workplace, where you both are trying to describe and to learn about a thing, and the language, the common language, just simply does not exist, right? So you might have like the feeling of your experience, and you might feel the awkwardness, right? Like that's something that we're looking for in DDD land, right? Like trying to be attuned to that awkwardness. That is the feeling when both the speaker and the hearer literally don't have the words to explain and understand what's happening. So we would say of people or groups that are not part of generating those stories and that language and those words, we would say that they are hermeneutically marginalized. So their story, their narrative is not a tool that most of us are carrying around in our toolbox to describe experience. So that makes, if you're hermeneutically marginalized, it makes it difficult for you to even understand your own lived experience because the language doesn't exist or isn't commonly known. Yes, so we have groups that are hermeneutically marginalized, and what we can get curious there is about creating a hermeneutical microclimate. And I'm trying to put like things in here so that we'll get lots of questions during the fireside chat part of this, but something that I think is interesting to think about specifically when we're thinking about DDD is this idea of creating a hermeneutical microclimate where we are generating this shared meaning and we are making it safe for people to come forward with their lived experience and not try to like cram it into the boxes that we already have, or use language that doesn't really fit, right? We want to create this microclimate where it's safe for people to just say like, I don't know what the right word is, but it's not that word, right? And go through the process of discovering what is right. Yes. So how can we kind of train our ears to these things? When we might be committing an act of testimonial injustice, we might say things or we might hear things like, don't be hysterical, right? Like there's something about you that would cause you to not have credibility here. So things that are kind of like about the person if we're tempted to say things like that, a dismissive remark about the person, that's usually testimonial injustice. Hermeneutical injustice is when we say things like, that's unbelievable, right? Like, it is believable, believe it, it really happened to me, you know? But if we're saying things like that, then we're probably committing an act of hermeneutical injustice. Some other words that I bet a lot of us have our ears tuned to already are just and should, and those could be aligned with different sorts of epistemic injustice, but a lot of times when we say you should just whatever, that's because there's some sort of information mismatch there. And usually if you're the person saying you should just X, Y, and Z, that's because you don't have the tools to have a full understanding of the situation, because if there was some obvious thing, chances are that person would already do it, right? So just and should, those could be aligned with testimonial injustice or hermeneutical injustice, but they're typically a good indicator that there's not common understanding of the situation. Yes, why does this matter? I'm sure you're already thinking of reasons, but I'll give you a few here. The first one, I think we miss a lot, and it's not just me thinking this, but there's research on it, when we focus only on justice, right? Same thing like in safety science, if we focus only on safety, if we like make our targets safety, then you get a lack of reporting of times that are unsafe or the near misses or whatever the case may be. So I think it's really important for us to be looking at injustice, not just justice, right? Because that can give us a really good indication of, places where our system is a little bit odd. So what does that mean? I think that if we get curious about epistemic injustice, that will lead us to some curiosity about resilience, right? Just what I was talking about before, where if we are attuning our ears to some of these things, then we can build more resilient software, we can build more resilient organizations, because we can be tuned into the things that are kind of like these near misses. We can be tuned in to the intuition that experts have about the systems, instead of just kind of disregarding that and not letting that work its way into our systems. We can learn a lot about how to mitigate risk, right? Like if we, some of these things that hit the market, right? Like Slack the other day, they had this new feature that they roll out. Yay, you can DM anyone. Woohoo, can't wait for that. It hits the market and then immediately people say, oh my gosh, this will 100% be used for abuse, right? Like this is going to be an HR nightmare. This is a nightmare for any community that uses Slack and doesn't have an HR department, all of these things, right? But if we are out there really being open to the lived experience of people, even if they're in a marginalized position, then we can hear those things before the feature makes it to market, right? And so that's probably a good thing this day and age, right? And I think about this a lot as we get faster as organizations at deploying new things to market, right? Like you really have to be open to the lived experience of the people who can give us feedback internally on those things. And obviously, if we are open to lived experience of people and we make it okay for people to voice their lived experience, and when we're really listening for when they don't feel it's safe to voice their lived experience, to share their lived experience, then we can get these weak signals before it becomes some really strong signal from the market, right? So if we are hearing from these experts, we can do those things. So we don't really want to be like speculating about the future, but more fully present in the present and listening for the weak signals from our own folks and our own experts. I also just love this quote from the book, The Challenger Launch Decision. Specialized knowledge further inhibits knowing. So there were a lot of people before the Challenger launched, there were a lot of people that had misgivings, right? But there was not the common language across roles, basically, to really articulate the risk, right? And so you end up where everyone has this feeling, and yet it's not actually being captured properly, like in reports and things like this. And we are dealing with this a lot, right? We have so many specialized disciplines, and we're so specialized, thinking about specialized technology, and how do we come together around a problem and exchange that information instead of just being basically isolated by our expertise. So something to think about, yes. And then a couple things just to get you thinking about what we can do to kind of combat these things. When we start a meeting or when we bring people together, be really clear about why each person is there. So I have this great / horrible story about going to a meeting with this vendor, and they're trying to sell us this big software extravaganza of awesomeness or something. And they spend all of this time like kind of interrogating the people who just have the appearance of being like the elite hacker or something like that, right? Like the guy wearing a hoodie and a like dinner jacket over it or something. Like they're really interested in hearing from that guy. And then the last 5 minutes of the meeting, someone says, hey, we only have 5 minutes left. Do you want to talk to the person who will decide if you're going to get paid or not? And you just see all of these sales guys, like the color drains out of their face. But the person who was going to decide if they were going to get paid or not was like this very quiet woman who isn't dressed like she came from Silicon Valley or anything like that. And so they basically just wasted hours of their time only to have 5 minutes to talk to the person who would decide if their software is actually doing what they said it would be doing. So what we could have all gotten back that time of our lives if we had just said, hey, you're here to sell us this, and we have this person over here who will decide if your product actually does the thing that you claim that it does. And then we have these other people that will be like internal customers. But then it would have just kind of leveled the epistemic playing field, I suppose, a bit there, and probably been more rewarding for everyone. The second thing is just asking this question: what would it take for that to be true? So sometimes someone will say something, it seems outlandish, like surely that doesn't happen in our business, right? Like that sounds, no, that's not a thing. Instead of just jumping to that point, maybe we just say, what would it take for that to be true? What would have to be true in our environment in order for that thing to make sense to that person? And that's where we end up getting a bunch of like sudden insights. If we just say, okay, let's assume that this outlandish thing is true. What in the surroundings would have to be true to make that possible? And that has a tendency to kind of uncover things for us. And then something that I do that is weird, and I fully admit it, and I also don't care. I have a trigger for me to reflect on whatever conversation I just had to see kind of, did I commit an act of epistemic injustice either against myself or against others? So for me, my trigger is when I walk through a doorway. So when I'm finished the meeting or whatever, and I go get a drink of water or something, I walk through that doorway, I ask myself, you know, what just happened there? Right? Was there anything that I just dismissed either about my own experience or someone else's experience without thinking? Were there any moments when it seemed super awkward, like all of us were having to work really hard at the conversation? And usually like a doorway, not that much time has passed between the conversation and when I walk through a doorway of some sort. So it's usually still like within the acceptable window for me to go back to that person and say like, hey, I think we just goofed up on that conversation. Can we revisit that? Or did you mean this? Or can you tell me more about that? So I have a little trigger for myself, and I generally find that to be a good idea. And then of course, just don't dismiss the intuition, feelings, and lived experience of yourself or of others, right? Even if it seems ridiculous or it seems wrong for the context, people are doing the things that they're doing and feeling the things that they're feeling for some sort of reason. It might seem completely mysterious to you, but that means that there's information there that you don't have, right? And so better just to be curious about that rather than dismissive. Here's a bunch of sources, but I'm sure someone will like post this or something, so you don't have to worry about it. And a lot of them, I'll be honest, are pretty academic and boring. Yeah, that's about it. That's epistemic injustice. Woohoo, yay, we did it.
Great, thanks. I think I have so many things popping in my mind in the last 20 minutes. Shall we, Christina, you? Shall I just start, or do you want to start?
You can jump in. I think we have a lot of overlapping questions.
Yeah. Yeah. So things that are you okay with that, Kat? Just
Yeah.
Start off. I don't see any question in the chat yet, but let's start with from a DDD perspective, right? Well, how does it impact domain crunching, and especially the thing that popped my mind watching one of your sessions, and I'm wondering how you think the domain language, ubiquitous language. What I usually hear is, right, in software development, developers are being ignored or are being injusticely, if I can say it so, not being able to talk with domain experts. There's usually maybe a PO or a business analyst in between. Is that one of these examples?
Yeah, definitely, right? Because you're now, so for me, when I think about DDD, I think a lot about the idea of hermeneutical injustice, right? Because typically in a lot of organizations, it's exactly that, right? And people are being denied even the opportunity to come together to try to create narrative resources to figure things out. And that doesn't just have an impact for when we are designing and developing the product, but it also has an impact through the entire life of the product, right? Like, how do we keep it working? How do we understand like what is needed from what the market needs from this product, right? And so every single one of those things, answering those questions, then becomes this super laborious process, right? And you can have CI and CD and all of these things all day long, and you can do 1 million deployments a day. But if it's taking you months or years to actually make sense of things, like, who cares how fast the technology is, right? If your actual knowledge, shared knowledge, is lagging that far behind, you know?
Yeah, I've had this at one point where a developer was just saying, just let me go one time with my user, so I know what they're experiencing, and then the analyst says no, just, so that I got triggered by the just. You will just get the user stories that you need to build. So yeah, I think that's one of the biggest problems at the moment.
Yeah, people are really turned off by that awkwardness, right? Like they feel like you're then putting this big burden on your customer, which you are to a degree, right? Because there is awkwardness, because we don't yet have the shared hermeneutic resources to make sense of everything. But I would rather have that incur that awkwardness at that point rather than all of the tiny injustices over the course of the product, right? Like if we have a product that doesn't speak the same language as our users, then what does that say about our users' experience? You know what I mean? That's basically saying your experience of your domain where you had the expertise is not valid because we decided that we're going to implement this product according to these engineering patterns that make no sense for you, right?
Because you're a customer, you have no idea.
Yeah, you're being alienated from your own expertise. That's inhumane to me.
Yeah.
But to me as a developer, the same. So it's not only the life of the product, but it's my life too, because what the hell? I mean, it is your interest. I won't understand this ever, because it is the interest of a company to have a great product. So what can be the reason to deny the presence in a meeting or a discussion?
Well, yeah, so I hear this a lot in my current work, and I hear it a lot of times, like these people, and this is again, maybe that's also a bit of injustice here, is the understanding of some people saying, well, I take it as my duty to take care of the chaos in that part and just tell my team the filtered stuff, right? I don't want to bother them too much with the conflict and the discussions that's going on there. So I'll give them filtered content so they don't need to worry. So there's also this one case I said was a developer who really wanted to, but sometimes you also have a team that doesn't want to and just want to code. So there's a other side flip coin as well. And I think that one is more harder, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I understand it, right? Because this industry is what it is. And we say like, oh, you're highly valued if you just want to code, right? Like we value people that are coding around the clock. Like we want to see your personal projects and all of this stuff. But when you zoom out from that a little bit, it is easy to see how you're basically saying in that scenario to the developers, like, I don't trust you to make sense of your world. I think that your epistemic capability is so immature that you will not be able to make sense of the thing that you live every day designing and developing this product. I don't think that you have the epistemic maturity to handle that. Like that is also not a humane working condition, right? Like you're not doing that person any favors. You're robbing them of the ability to make sense of their work, like proper sense, situate it in the world, right? And to me, that is just really sad. Like, no kidding that everyone's getting burned out and all of these things. Like, yeah, because your brain is having to work so hard every day to make sense out of things because you don't have access to the domain expertise. Like that is heartbreaking,
This is the crazy part. It's totally counterproductive. It is against all logic because you have to work this out by yourself.
Yeah, it's crazy making. That's exactly what it is, right? Like, you're asking yourself, gosh, I'm a good developer. Why is this so hard? Or why do I keep coming up against all of these things that just don't quite fit? Or how come every time, like, this is engineered perfectly, I have this sophisticated test suite, I have all these things, and I deploy it, and users exhibit this very strange behavior, or whatever the case may be, right? But like, that's enough to make you crazy.
Yeah, and usually you always see it back that people celebrate because the new feature got delivered, and not what is the impact on our users, right? What is the impact on their experience and their, yeah. So that's where that might be. I know the 10 ways you are in the feature factory. That's all the way epistemical injustice.
Yeah, totally. And of course, like, we get into these things, sort of like we're talking about, right? Like, what narratives do we prize in this industry? The ones where you code around the clock and things like that. And those are really delivery oriented narratives, right? There's not much about like nurturing and caring and any sort of like sustained relationship with the product and with the users. It's like, well, I delivered it.
I'm done. Yeah, no impact.
Yeah.
And this is what we need. DDD needs this discussions, needs this insight. It won't work without this. And we had last year, I don't know if it's DDD or just we are going that way, but we had a lot of discussions about user experience, user journey, because even DDD doesn't matter if the user journey is wrong. I can use the nicest language and make the greatest software. If the user journey, it doesn't fit to the user, then it's wrong.
Yeah. And it evolves over time, right? So we could create a great user journey, but now something has changed, right? Whether it's a big event like COVID, or it's any number of other much more subtle things, but like, the world is always changing. And for me, it feels really weird because we have software which we can theoretically change faster than we can change our behaviors as a society, right? But we still end up with this like strange mismatch. And I feel that it's because we don't have a good set of practices that are common in the industry around just making sense of our world and situating ourselves in the things that we make in the world.
And Andrew's article is coming in my mind. It was 2 days ago. He was writing about the conservative and the old school, one organization fits for all mindset. And this is what we don't have. This is what you say. What you're saying, we are still thinking they are HR, they are project managers, they decide this part, and you are a coder, you decide how your line is ending, and let me do the rest. And this is bullshit. This doesn't work, and we're still keeping it that way.
Yeah, we just have our fixation on the parts, and perhaps not so much attention to the interactions.
Yeah. So another thing that comes to mind is talking about injustice. It's the understanding across people who don't know much about the industry, and I don't want to call them non-IT or non-tech, because there actually aren't, because they're using both of them, but more people who might not be involved in the design of the architecture of the software and everything. So understanding these understanding the concept, as we say in DDD, right? We want to have a bounded context for a purpose with a specific language. However, if you look at all the uncomfy conversation I had, it's mostly about, but how do I get my one view of a user then and everything, right? So there's no common language again about how to build software, I guess, or about these patterns. Is that something also that needs to be worked upon before we can actually do this thing?
Yeah, I think that's the tricky thing though, right? That there's not really, when it comes to our epistemic resources, there's not really a before and after for a lot of things. There's like a lot of befores and a lot of afters. And, you know, whether we like it or not, we're marching into a digital era. And yes, it is odd to say the least, right? That we have software that's touching everyone's life basically every day. And it's, even though it's such a young industry, there's so little understanding like out generally about how it comes into being, right? And there's still definitely the perception of like some grumpy guy like goes in a corner and spits out code, and that's kind of what it is, right? And so that, of course, leads to lots of injustice, right? Or we have a perception of what technical people are and how they like to interact. And no, that's just not how humans like to interact, right? And so, yeah, it's really interesting to see our industry, such a young industry, as far as like how society views it. I think it has really quickly gone towards commodity, right? Like there's a good chance you don't know a ton about how your electricity was generated, right? Like you probably catch things in the news about wind or solar or something like that, but you probably don't have a great understanding of like how it gets to your house and things like this, right? Because it's basically a commodity, and we've just so quickly gone in that direction for software, and it feels weird. I don't know. It just feels weird, right? Because like we are not as mature as that industry for sure, but yet the perceptions are kind of similar. I don't know. It's very interesting.
What Tobias right here about trust too goes both ways. So yes, it has to be both ways. He also had a question. So if the epistemic injustice in the traditional subject matter expert dev relationship is so obvious, and I think we can assume everybody is quite aware, why is everyone still keeping it in place? Someone has to benefit from keeping power structures intact, don't they?
Well, my friend out there in the audience, I'm sure we'll argue about this later, but I don't think people have to benefit, or I guess, yes, some people will benefit, right? But it is perhaps not as much benefit as they could have in a different paradigm, right? But when we lack the resources to even describe something better, which in many, many cases we do, right? We don't even have words to describe how things could be better. So of course you can't, it's very difficult to like strive towards something better when you can't even articulate that there are other ways of operating, right? So it feels like I just need to make myself valuable in this paradigm, because surely we can't develop software, we can't design software in any other way. So I need to find a way to be valuable here. And so I'm going to be the person, the translator, that basically all knowledge in the system must pass through my epistemic filters, which is ludicrous, right? Like now the total knowledge within your system is constrained by one person's existing beliefs. That doesn't sound very resilient to me.
No.
You know,
but I think it's also, yeah, sorry, no, I think it also has to do perhaps what Tobias was saying, right? I don't trust you. Also, again, epistemic injustice with someone wants something, but they don't know how. If I let my house, if someone's building my house, I know relatively what they're talking about because education,
and you can see it.
Privilege education, I can see it, exactly. I can see it as well. So I have a shared language and I do trust them because I know, but I think because software is also so young, And there's so many things out there that went wrong that trust in software is also a bit,
Yeah, it was
low.
rapidly adopted over a very short amount of time. So, and that means we go far towards like ubiquity of software, right? But that also means then failures become super conspicuous, because something that everyone has and uses, we expect that to be in a state where it's very reliable, very repeatable, right? But we are just babies in this industry, right? And so there are these failures that are sometimes at a very large scale. And it just, I think it ends up just exacerbating the problem, right? And it's not a physical good. You can't see it moving. There aren't like clear steps to assembling the thing, right? There's no way to really say like how complete it is. And so when we break things down, we deliver more incrementally. That, of course, can go to establishing trust. But then if we have a failure and everything becomes super conspicuous, and it's now conspicuous, and we don't share language, and so we can't even come together to describe what the problem is, right? You're going to have some incident commander that, again, is supposed to be the like go between the people who are experiencing the outage and the people that are allegedly going to fix it, right? And no one speaks the same language, and now we have to have this third party that's going to translate between, like, so you end up making a bad situation now also like very emotionally charged and awkward. Terrific. Where do I sign up?
I think that's also well, I'm just starting a new project, and that's always the challenge, right? How do we inform the board or something, or how do we inform the progress? So the first thing I would do is like, okay, what is a thing they could understand where we can have the shared language on this progress? Because they cannot see the software progression, but I could make them understand. And I'm reminded about the real use, perhaps, of user stories. It actually tells you a story instead of it being a thing in Jira or whatever tool people are using, telling people what to do. But actually, for me, a user story is well, just what it says, right? It's telling a story, but not only to the dev people, but also from the dev people to the stakeholders.
Yeah,
saying,
because
well,
we have to co-create meaning.
Yeah,
you can't possibly just dictate it.
Yeah, and from there you can have collaboration, and actually it's a great way to also report, right? Well, these are the user stories. They're about the same size. I don't care about estimation, but they're about the same size. We can do this and that many time, and maybe when is this story complete, right? When can we actually do, for instance, the MVP, or when is the first release, and when it's something valuable that turns into a nice, well, common ground or common understanding of the product. So we could say that's really important. So that would be one way that people can already start creating that collaboration about their soft product, which people cannot see being built. While I'm standing on someone building a house, I can actually see the progress. So I think that's really important then to start with.
Yeah.
How are we actually having this shared language over the progress of the product being built?
Yeah, I think that what I have noticed through the years is that a lot of times the people that are saying like, when will this be delivered? When can you have this for me? All of those things. It's because they don't really have an understanding of what we're making, because we don't have common language. So they just kind of think, well, when it's delivered, I'll be able to use it and understand what the heck they're talking about. And so, of course, like that's already setting you up, because now you're each in your own heads coming up with like, what is it that this thing is supposed to do? And certainly there are some things that we can only figure out by using the thing, but there's also so much that we can do to build that trust from the very beginning. Like, I want you to understand what I'm building, and I want to understand what I'm building.
Yeah, we are using it behavior-driven development. The acceptances are written by my PO. In the beginning, he just was scared what to do and how to do, and we created a folder for him to told him, you have an idea, you type it here. You just look that its format somehow did not break the pipeline, but you cannot break anything. You can push and check in. And since then, he knows exactly what the pipeline is and when it breaks, because he breaks it twice because of merging issues. And the understanding is huge. And we stepped away from this. In the user stories, we don't have QM when then because it's inhibiting. It doesn't help to tell me what you want. Don't tell me how just explain with your words. This is perfect. And then we make together the acceptance criteria, and then you can put them in with your thoughts in this BDD format. And this was the bridge. He was very scared before. I don't know how you implement the solution for this. Okay, but you can test it, you can see it, and you know exactly what's happening. You don't have to know the language, the syntax. You just have to have a feeling in your fingers what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
this was a huge step.
Yeah, appreciating the feelings and intuition. Yep.
Not to be afraid, because it's somewhere in the cloud, somewhere happening something, and I don't know what kind of voodoo you are doing. And sometimes I'm showing him exactly the lines of code, and then he can see it, and if it's not a huge monolith, then he can also understand it somehow. And with this step to write this PDD Gherkin, he also contributing, and this is the biggest impact. It's not distress anymore, and he cannot do anything wrong. This is a safe place. It has to be a safe place.
I think that story really gets to something that as I look at the history of our industry, it just seems to keep happening. It seems like we, who are the people in this industry and doing the work here, we keep coming to these methods that are aligned with power with, like, we're going to work together, and power to, we want to achieve these outcomes. And then we keep getting like rubber banded back to this paradigm of power over, which I think doesn't really match up well with the digital world, right? Because power over is based on scarcity and like all of this kind of physical domination, right? Like dominating our environment. And in a digital landscape, almost anything is possible, right? Yeah, and so exactly. That power over doesn't really make sense there. So I think we naturally want to go towards power with and power to, because it makes sense in a digital ecosystem where you can create the world that you want, right? Like you don't have to bring the physical goods here and all of these things. But the organizations in which we work and the way that we have been socialized are all kind of aligned to that power over. And so it feels like we go in that direction, like XP moved us in that direction. We don't care how productive you as an individual developer are, right? Like we care about the outcomes and we care about what you can do with each other. And then they're like all these things. So like, well, how do we properly 9-box and assess people that are doing pair programming or, you know, any of those things, right? And so it's just like that inertia of the power over keeps pulling us back towards it.
Yeah, I think that's and someone says any facilitation, ask any facilitation tips to help colleagues be curious about what could be, and if we don't have a solution, that only intuitions. So one thing again, starting a new job, it's like, I hear this constantly, like it's just the push down force, the power over. And it says that's going to stop today. They're coming to our refinements. If they want something being built, they come to our refinements and explain it with us. And if we don't, well, I need to be boundary here, right? If we don't deem it ready, and if we don't think it can be delivered in 2 weeks, then we won't do it, because here's a list that we need to start building. So first, make that boundary, because then the conversation can start instead of so pushing a bit back. That's the first thing I usually do. And user stories are perfect for that, to push back and saying, well, you need to deliver this. And then we can be sure that in 2 weeks we can actually deliver the product.
Yeah, definitely. Just emphasizing over and over again that it's not us making a product, right? It's all of us making a product.
Yeah. So do you have any of these facilitation tips to help colleagues be curious about what could be? Even if you don't have solutions and only intuitions?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I have all boring things, like at the very beginning of the meeting or whatever, just say, we are not going to say just or should today. So if you say just or should, the very next thing out of your mouth needs to be a question, so that people get more curious. And it also opens the door for us to kind of have opinions and shape the facilitation of the meeting together, right? Like that opens the door for you to crack a joke about someone saying just or should, or like, oh, I almost said it. There's obviously something I don't understand here, those kinds of things. Emphasizing why people are there and appreciating them for being there. Like if you are joined by your customer, why is this person here? And what do they know? And, just emphasizing what different people are bringing to the table, so that you kind of combat that testimonial injustice where someone might get written off for no reason. Yeah. A lot of times I have people classify things, like through the course of a meeting, we come up with all these different things, and I'll have them classify those things at the end of the meeting or at various checkpoints. Is this constraint an actual rule, or is this a routine? Because a lot of times in organizations, those routines get so ossified that people believe that they're rules. And then I say, okay, great. I would like to actually read that rule, if at all possible. And then you go to find it, and turns out it doesn't actually exist. So that gets to be interesting. And just talking with people about constraints and freedoms. Like if you wanted to deliver this, what constraints could you use, or do you think you'll have to use? And which freedoms could you use, or do you think you'll have to use? I don't know. Also, I just love the idea of absurdity. And that's something Miranda Fricker, who came up with the idea of epistemic injustice, she writes about, like finding some absurdity in your current situation, in your current context. Like, this really is absurd that every night we email a spreadsheet to someone else, and they're like that, that's wild, but that's been working for so long, and it's powering our business, and everyone then can like have a good laugh, like, look, well, Excel is, there's all these funny things, like Excel is powering 90% of the world or something like that, right? And opening that door of absurdity sometimes can like let people also point out things like, oh yeah, we do this and it doesn't match my experience at all. Like, I feel ridiculous every time I do it. Okay, cool. Tell me more about that. I don't know.
Yeah, those are nice helps, I hope. Well, for me it is, but I hope the one asking the questions also could, and if not, please say so. Yeah. And I think because we're a young industry, we keep finding these shared common things, like tech debt came to mind, right? Explaining tech debt, and you still, after all these years, once I'm not actually sure when it got introduced in our industry, but still people find it hard. It's the second day, but still people find it hard to talk about it, and it's not common yet. So a lot of injustice going on in that word as well, I can imagine.
Tech debt is such a good example, right? Because we have wildly different understandings within the industry of what that means, right? Like some people say, oh, well, we're going to push this to production, even though we know it's not production scale yet. We'll just incur some tech debt, you know? And then other people are like, oh, well, the usage pattern of the users changed and things evolved, and now we have tech debt. I'm like, wow, those are two entirely different things.
I told you, these bloody customers, they just do what they want.
There's so many times in like my daily life when I'll be like, oh, well, I know how to work around this, whatever this thing is and whatever software I'm using. And then I just find myself being like, oh God, I am that horrible customer that someone's like looking at my behavior right now. Like, what is she doing?
Okay, but at the same time, you tell everybody, please don't use Safari because it's not supported. This is what I do at home.
Yeah. So and Xavier, or I hope I pronounce it correctly, says, yeah, tech debt, what does it mean? But what about these use of metaphors? Is it a good tool to create shared understanding, to create this justice, or to avoid this? What's your thoughts on because tech debt is a metaphor in itself about, well, having depth on your card, right?
Yeah. I have such complicated feelings about this. Like I have a lot of respect for the clean language community that kind of says, get rid of metaphor, but also our brains are programmed to do that, right? And they're like, even within the literature on epistemic injustice, there's like the use of the of things that are metaphors, right? Like waking up to something. Well, no, the person didn't literally wake up, right? But now they have new hermeneutic resources available to them, and they can now wake up to their own experience, describe their own experience. So I don't know, it kind of gets into this rabbit hole that I truly don't know what is right? Like our brains are programmed to think that way. So it's going to be extremely difficult. So it might be worth it in some cases to say, we want to collectively take on this cognitive overhead of stripping overhead. I wouldn't even be able to say that, right? Stripping metaphor from our language because we don't think we have even like a small foundation of shared hermeneutic resources, right? So we may say like it's worth it for us to take on that cognitive load to do that work and get rid of the metaphor, or we might say like that effort is not needed at this point because we do have some shared cultural understanding or something like that. Yes, metaphors we live by. Yes. Someone just pop that in the chat.
This is also my experience. Shared metaphors are very helpful if you build them together, but not commonly created metaphors or used to use metaphors are could be a danger.
Yeah, and the same thing can happen there, right? Like we might benefit, like the cohesion and the coherence in our group might benefit from some of these metaphors, but also that can really quickly go in the direction of like erecting walls between, you and other groups, right? So I don't know. It's messy.
Yeah, it is.
I think visualization is the best way to overcome this. It's not enough.
Yes.
A metaphor can lead to injustice for sure, because we don't know what we may use technical words, the right words, but we understand totally different stuff behind it. So it is a danger. But visualizing things, right? We are taking meeting minutes together always together,
Yeah.
never afterward, because afterwards, who knows? We can see it, we can't see it, and this is the way we are building our understanding.
Yeah. The only thing, I love visualization techniques, and like I am big in the wordly mapping community where we're constantly creating these visual artifacts. But I have also worked with such talented developers who are visually impaired. And so then it's like we need a visual language, which I know sounds kind of weird, right? But something to describe our visualizations so that people can paint like a mental picture of that. Yeah, it's just there's no easy way of doing the work of creating shared meaning, right? Like It is work.
Yeah, it is work. And it's not coding. But it's thinking, and it's the basis for everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about creating it. So when we look at, and this is one of the most interesting topics I'm in, right? So I could create a bounded context pattern for a team with their domain experts and really crisply describe that language for software. And that all goes okay. And this team has really in-depth knowledge of that part, and they're in that boundary. And it's something, when we discuss this up front, that's something you interest us as well. But what about the exchange of narratives across the ecosystem, right? Across bounded contexts in DDD lingo, and even across the domains. So that goes even. Do we have that? You call it the hermeneutic resources to describe that emergent behavior across the system? Can you explain a bit more what you mean by that? Because this is what interests me more, because that's the biggest challenge. How do you keep this across?
Yeah, I honestly, it's something that I have been grappling with so much. And my friend Jay Bloom and I have been thinking about this and talking about this. And I don't know what the answer is, right? Because there could be the danger that we do exactly what is described in the book about the Challenger launch, right? Where we have pockets of understanding and then zero ability to exchange stories within the pockets. So I think what we might be missing is some long-term broad scope soup sort of that all of those other stories exist in, placing us in some sort of this is a transition that we're going through that will take years or something like that. And that can give us a kind of playground in which to exchange stories. And I think that's missing in most of the organizations that I encounter, right? There's a push more and more and more towards acceleration, towards continuous. And it seems like that means that we turn away from thinking about longer term transitions. So we're losing the ability to describe a bigger context, right? And so we can develop a set of language or a story in this space. And because we can't place it in a bigger space, we now have lost the ability to exchange that information with other small spaces. So it's we need sets of nested outcomes, sets of nested time spans in order to even start exchanging stories across those contexts. And it doesn't seem like we're getting any better at that. It actually seems like we're getting worse.
Yeah, I think what I also notice is that, again, it's so focused on. So, for instance, people who know me, who know I'm not a safe framework admirer at all.
What?
But
Really?
what I do like is the PI planning as a concept. Every quarter you do this syncing part. Only what I usually see is being abused by just throwing user stories from top to bottom again. While one time I said, well, maybe exchange it for stuff like big picture event storming, where you actually tell the story, where are we and where do we want to go, right? And I think these rituals, and usually when I come to a company, we do big picture event storming and context mapping together. And what Jay Bloom, dancing with boundaries, he said it. I really like that, right? Because the boundaries in a negotiation. But usually this is a one-off, and we're not embedding this as, well, let's create some rituals in the company where we keep telling these stories in a structured way of these negotiations where the boundaries lie. And Alberto says every 2 to 3 months you can do this big picture event storming just to resync, tell the story of the company, where we are now and where we're actually heading, and how you fit in this part, and keep it at a business story and not, of course, a technical.
Yeah, I think it would be awesome if, like, at the strategic level, we had the same kinds of conversations that we're talking about right now that are more at like the product level, right? But if we had some of those same tools, just a longer time horizon or like a cross ecosystem, because I think a lot of the information that we become sensitized to, the people who make products and see how products interact with users in the world, it, just like you said, there's kind of a unidirectional vertical alignment. So this person tells that person what to do. Well, what about the weak signals that need to go back up that, right? And what about the horizontal coherence across? So we're really good at unidirectional vertical alignment, not so good at horizontal coherence or bi-directional.
I always tell people this story, and I'm not sure it's true, but it was at AWS, the developer, right, talking about unidirectional. The developer said, you know what, I got a really interesting idea. I got all this data about people buying stuff. I could actually see if someone bought a product, what other people who bought that product also bought, right? And I can show that to that customer, because I would be really interesting as a customer to see that. And then I think the PO or the analyst said, no, that's a terrible idea, right? You just, and you know what every e-commerce, business now has, right? It has that functionality. So is that what you're explaining, right? About unidirectional and
the weak signal from using the product, or from interacting with the people that are using the product, or from having the experience of continuing to interact with the development of the product or the operation of the product. And so there might be some really weak signal that's just one person's individual insight. And how do we, at the strategic level, sensitize ourselves to the weak signals that are important for strategic direction? Right. Yeah. So that we can be like, whoa, yeah, I need to hear more about that, even though we currently have nothing to describe that. Like, I need to hear more.
And I think there is, and it's what I always keep reminding myself, we're so focused on autonomy inside a team and not so much about agency, right? What is my, if you're just doing it autonomous, it's really egocentric, saying I will do what I do, but you don't see the bigger picture of the company and I think we're so focused. Also, you're on mute, by the way, Christina.
You pay now, and it's
I just saw you too. No, I see so much focus on autonomy, and well, actually we're not autonomous people. We like to live in experience stories and bigger things. And I, especially also, every time I hear people say we need to microservices architecture because we want to be autonomous, I'm like, do you want to be autonomous, or do you actually, what's behind that? Again, just let me be and let me code in my own way type of profile.
Okay, but autonomy doesn't mean I don't care about the rest of the world.
It shouldn't, but it's what I usually experience, right?
Okay, this so.
And I think Jape has this whole, and not sure where it came from, but I heard it from Jape. He says, well, there is a big difference between autonomy and agency from, I think, a research perspective, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. So basically, they're just like not. There are not a lot of things where you operate like an autonomous way, or where things can be used in an autonomous way, but you can act with agency. You can have like agency within whatever this context or structure is. Yeah, so it is quite different. Yeah.
I think this is because of the other part that we had in the topic, this power plays and this pushing away. And now the companies are slowly understand that they still need us somehow for somewhat, and cannot just say, go and write your lines and make this working, because maybe we'll say no. I need more information. And this could be a fight, or the battle to be taken seriously. And this is the part of the autonomy. This is how I see it. Just let me demonstrate you that you can have trust in me, and I won't let you down. So give me autonomy to demonstrate you that I can work with you and not.
I mean, in that scenario, there's a bunch of things happening, right? Like there is this movement of like, how can we replace programmers? Can we have programs programming and all of this stuff? And
no code.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So I think there are so many things, even in like how we do accounting for organizations, right? Like publicly traded organizations. And there are accounting rules for labor, and there are accounting rules for machines. And there are all these things built up in our organization where, like, if you are feeling that pressure, the economic pressure, right, to make things look cheaper, make them look more appealing to the market, people buy stock, whatever, then you want to have fewer people acting with agency within your system because they're expensive. So it's not even like the trust there, but it's also that we have this, again, like a legacy of rules that we can't even really articulate across boundaries. Like, why is it cheaper to have a machine or a contractor than it is to have an employee?
It is not. We had a question from Xavier about this. Hence the need, the demand, and the money, hence the power, is all on one side of the equation. How do we frame the conversations to be on equal footings? Or how do we even bring awareness of the need to be on equal footings? I would say by saying
so
no.
Those things when we're talking about money or whatever resources, right? That's usually an indication that we're talking about power over, because we're talking about the allocation of scarce resources, right? And so if we can have a conversation about power too, what do we want to achieve? And then we'll think about the resources, right? And reorienting the conversation, just like Kenny, you were saying earlier, right? Where we're talking about, okay, well, what do you actually want here? There is something besides cheap, right? You want to do X cheaply. What is the X, right? And that can kind of change. So everything we do is still some negotiation of power, but if we could talk about a different kind of power, then that, in my experience, tends to yield more fruitful results for everyone, right?
Exactly.
Just maybe
It's
over a different
no-brainer.
time span. Yeah.
It's just a no-brainer. So I still want, as an employee, to work for a company who can pay me in 2 months too. So this is, for me, this is the bottom line. It is not me against you, but we together, because after that, we together won't have a job. So
Yeah.
let's make it
But that
work.
again is a lot of times a time span mismatch, right? Like one person is, okay, for this quarter, I have to report earnings and I need them to look like this. And the other person is like, well, like, I don't want to be looking for a new job this year in a pandemic. So my time span now is like, I'm going to be here for multiple years. I want to do something that is sustainable for multiple years. That's how I want to create these things. And then, but then you have the other person that's like, no, the end of this quarter is in June. I need things to look this way. So there's a huge time span mismatch there.
Especially
Culture.
at the end of the year, you need to fully finish your budget for that year, because else next year you won't get it.
Yeah, just completely arbitrary. Has nothing to do with the actual like cadence or heartbeat of our products.
And I think that's and I think, well, we don't have a lot of questions. Maybe Christina.
You answered all of them.
Yeah, you answered all of them. So I think, to wrap it up, I think most importantly, what I hear is how can we actually create the same story together with our business, not only on domain level, but also about the concepts that we're using, right? So I think that's something I knew, but wasn't really focusing on. But I think that's really important, how not only can we create a product or a domain language, right, together as experience what our users do, but also share a similar story about why are we actually building it this way? Like, why are we actually maybe doing extreme programming that way? Right?
Yeah.
I think for me, that's I knew this in the back of my mind, but I didn't deem it so important.
It is totally important. We expect that the business people are taking time and explain to us stuff. So then we have to do the same. We have to explain what we are doing, because otherwise it's only one-sided. And why should they trust?
Yeah, they cannot trust because they cannot live it.
The only thought what I had was regarding the first part, because there's a lot of gender gap in between these lines in the first few sides. So it was a total deep dive in our world, but we didn't really thought about this. And you said again about problems when you don't have the language, and this is what we are fighting. It's hard today to find the language. I had, I think, 3 days Twitter thread about how to close the gap between terms and knowledge, how to bring people to read something and not use words which they are using, which they don't know where they are coming from. But I think we don't have the time for this part now, but this is still this is the hard part.
Yeah.
Well, we can go,
of course.
If you want to go in, if you still have time, we can tackle this one. You're okay?
I'm fine.
Yeah.
Cat has 10 minutes pause between the two sessions, but yeah, sure. I don't know if we can go very late, but I also don't know if there are answers for these questions, how to find the wordings, how to build bridges.
Yeah, I think it goes exactly to what you said just before that it is work and someone has to do that work. So a lot of times, like a Twitter thread, I'll say something and someone will respond with something that is sort of ignorant, right? And then people will reply, it's not her job to educate you, which it is not. I am not paid to do that. So that is a fact.
Yeah.
However, someone needs to do that work, right?
Yeah. Please,
like
you can take this
building
job.
understanding, right?
Yeah.
So instead of replying, it's not her job to educate you. Perhaps if you feel the urge to reply in that way, maybe it could be your job for a moment to educate or to get curious about that, right? Like, it is work. Someone has to do the work. It's not going to magically happen.
Exactly.
Right? Like, people aren't going to just wake up one day and be like, oh, I'm very aware of gender imbalance now, and I'm very aware of racial inequity. Like, no, it is work and someone has to do it. And what is really important is that we don't just take marginalized groups and say it's solely your job, your problem to do the work of building the understanding. Like, that is what allyship is to jump in and say, hey, I'm going to do some of this work of building the understanding. You know, I don't know if any of that was helpful, but I did that all in 2 minutes. So you don't have to be worried about the time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think this was it. I think it was very interesting. Hope you enjoyed it as well. And we're going to close the stream. And I would like to thank everyone for listening, watching, and asking questions. And especially thank you, Kat, for introducing us to this topic. And
thank you for having me. This was great fun.
Yeah, and I know you're really active on Twitter, so people can find you on Twitter. And
yes.
We make sure the reading list will be
cool.
available there. And so to everyone there listening, we're going to close the stream and we're going to talk a bit more, maybe see how long we're going to talk on Zoom, and hope to see you next